I'm making a chair, and in this second part I'll first turn my attention to the ellipse that will form the chair back. I can make use of some offcuts here. I just can't bring myself to throw away pieces of nice wood, and every now and then they come in handy. I flatten them in the face vise, which works well for short pieces like these that don't overhang the vise jaw. And when one has been trued up using winding sticks, I can use that piece to check the flatness of all the rest and mark the flattened side as a reference face. Then I scribed their thickness and planed the far edge most of the way down to the line so I could hog off the waste without splintering. This side gets smoothed as well, and off camera I checked them for parallel with calipers, which is important for the upcoming operations. Next I made some rough cuts for the lengths and angles I'll need. I used the full-size drawing to figure this out, finding that I could use 3 lengths and 3 different angles to make an ellipse that should look rather even. This needs to be very precise, so I used trigonometry to make plywood wedges corresponding to my angles, and used double-sided tape to stick them to my shooting board. The wedges take care of the angle, and then I can sneak up on the length by comparing it to the drawing. When all parts that need the first angle are done, I pop off the wedge and press down the next. I used 8 segments for the ellipse, and when I had gone through all 3 angles where they were needed, they came together like this. The corners were numbered to keep track of the assembly, then I exposed the drawer again to mark where I intended for the inner and outer contours to end up after shaping. This was squared up to the face, and then in between those lines, but offset a bit towards the inside, I placed 2 guide lines for dowels across each joint. The distance between the dowel lines correspond to a quick jig I made for this operation that puts 2 holes into the end of each part, vertically centered. I'm not very happy with this solution. It worked, but without a drill press I didn't get the guide holes in the jig absolutely perfect, and without a metal sleeve they wore out and got even less accurate very quickly. I also had to glue it up with a slow setting epoxy because of all the dowels that had to be inserted and then pushed simultaneously. This small assembly took an absolutely unreasonable amount of time and clamping force to glue up. I wish I had made the extra effort to make the ellipse segments half-lap together instead, or resaw them into 2 layers and stagger the joints. I think the result would have been equal, but the process more enjoyable. But anyway, it went together, and then I could plane it because my theoretically aligning dowels are only as accurate as the jig. At this point I realized I have made a little mistake. This is the upper back rail between the back legs. I thought I had enough width here to go, all the way between the 2 back legs, but as it has turned out, the clamping pressure has squeezed the ellipse a little bit narrower, and it's now maybe 1 millimeter too narrow, and when I shape the ellipse, that is of course going to cut into it a little bit further and expose this beach behind it, and I don't want that. So I'm gonna have to fix that by using a couple of scraps like so. And when doing patches like this, it's of course very important to try to find grain that matches. So on this side here, the grain is running off in that direction a little bit. So I found a piece that has a similar angle there. Very little of these pieces will remain. Almost all of this will get cut away, but still I want to make sure that the grain matches as well as possible. Yes, thank you, past me, but we're doing voiceover now, haven't you heard? You know, with a script, so we don't have to cut out all your and awkward pauses. Now, where was I? Oh, right, it's time for the vertical beech support. First, I took the shoulder-to-shoulder distance and marked this centered on the part. This doesn't need to be exact in this case, so I went slightly undersized on purpose. It'll be plenty strong without the shoulders actually contacting the ellipse. Then I marked some extra length for dovetails and cut off the excess. I set a marking gauge to the same distance I used for the tenon cheek on the horizontal beech part, and scribed this from the face without the half-lap joint, the front face, on the vertical. I also used this setting to essentially extend the cheek on the front of the tenoned piece, where the ellipse will be let into it. On the vertical, I squared a couple of lines across the end, and cut out a dovetail shape by sawing 2 random shallow angles down to the baseline. With the cross pieces dry assembled, I centered the ellipse over them and marked where the cherry gets let in. The depth for this is set by pushing the gauge rod down onto the dovetail like so, demonstrating how out of flat my bench is at the same time. Something should be done about that. I sawed and cleared out the majority of the waste on all these joints, so I could router plane them at the same time and get an even depth. Then a dry fit. I'll hold the assembly up against the window so the light lets me align the drawing with the real thing, and then punch the focal points of the ellipse. This is only because I drew the ellipse on the back of the main drawing, so I didn't want to cut it out. It would have been more convenient to make them on separate pieces of paper, but yeah, if you for whatever reason don't want to cut out a template, this can work. Then I sawed out the curve and smoothed it. With a light cut, sharp edge and a little bit of skew, this spoke shave can go against the grain rather well, which cannot be completely avoided on assemblies like this. Then I had to create small flat spots, essentially extending the tenon shoulders, where the chair legs will seat against the ellipse. I blended these into the curve when I had taken them down to the scribe lines. And then I could get these cross pieces permanently installed. This piece of plywood is going to be the base for the back cushion. I located it by lining up the center lines to the corresponding marks on the cherry and drew where it needs to be recessed. I want this rebate to go as deep as the cross pieces, so I set my marking gauge using them and scribed all the way around the inside. Creating a curved rebate like this seemed quite intimidating, but I held the piece in the tail vise with an extra clamp for downwards pressure and began by having at it with a gouge to remove the majority of the waste while keeping the constantly changing grain direction in mind. Then I took another gouge with a flatter sweep and walked around the perimeter. I removed the entire pencil line, figuring that should be enough clearance for a layer of fabric around the inserted piece. And lastly, the router plane gets to do its thing again until the rebate was down to depth. A small back-bent gouge puts a quick radius on the edge to be gentler to the cushion when putting it in place. The plywood goes in easily with a millimeter or so of play, as intended. Before the final glue up, I quickly went back to the front legs and rail, flushing up these joints with chisel and card scraper. And then it was finally glue up time. While that dried, I squared up these parts, called knee blocks, and selected where to put each one. With more forethought, I would have had offcuts from each leg to use, so the grain and color would have been a better match. But for a practice chair that itself is entirely made from offcuts, this'll do. When the main glue up was dry, I proceeded to glue in the blocks, and for small parts like these, you can usually just rub them a little to make the glue hold the weight, giving you 2 free hands to get the first clamp on. I put a small dowel in the concave curve to avoid marring it with the clamp. I cleaned up the transition between side rail and back leg. And then when the knee blocks were dry, I carved them to match the swell of the leg and the curve of the rail. The blocks under the front rail need to be ever so slightly curved the other way, since the chair sweeps forward a little in the middle, so here I went bevel down to make this compound curve. I'm starting to embrace sanding. I used to really hate it, and I still don't like it, but it has its place as a way to blend different surfaces that were smoothed with different tools. This is 240 grit, I believe. And then I checked if the legs were even. In this case, they actually looked good with no tweaking, but if they were out at all, I would just carefully hit the longer ones with a block plane and keep checking like this. The last piece that needs to be made is the seat, and I decided to save some time by not making a traditional frame and use plywood instead. It'll be my first go at upholstery, and I expected to do a bad job, so I didn't want to spend much time here. I'd rather make a proper frame for my next attempt when I have a bit more of an idea of what I'm doing. So I marked where the back legs are and cut out these notches, and then I could place the chair onto the ply and draw my shape. The edges were rounded to be more gentle to the fabric. Next up, I'm going to quickly go through the upholstery, and I want to reiterate, I don't know how to do this. I want to go in blind and experience the mistakes so that when I research the process later, I'll have some understanding for what can go wrong and a better chance at grasping why things are done the way they are. For me, this experimental first attempt is a very important part of learning that really pays off even if the result is terrible. In fact, it's kinda like the worse it turns out and the more I realize I don't understand, the better foundation I'll have for absorbing information in the next step, which is looking into videos and literature on the subject. So I used a cushion from my old sofa. I was replacing it anyway, so I saved some material for this. Apparently there was a thinner white layer sandwiched between two thicker yellow ones. I pulled this out and decided that one thick and one thin layer was a good height for what I was making, along with a piece of this thin, white, soft stuff. It was in the sofa cushion, so I'll use it in mine as well. The stack felt just a tiny bit too firm here, so I added a second layer of the thin material. The fabric is a curtain I bought from a charity shop, and I just cut it to size with some margin and did my best to stretch it tight and staple it down. The small elliptical cushion was done in the same way. Now let's move back to something I'm a bit more comfortable with, boiled linseed oil. I thinned it down about 50-50 with turpentine to help it soak deeper into the wood, and diluted like this, it's very pleasant to apply with a soft brush. It also makes the shop smell like a pine forest, which isn't the worst. The first coat is of course always the most spectacular to watch, but it's not enough to give the surface the full saturation with polymerizing oil that we want. I did about 6 or 7 coats in total, adding more and more boiled linseed oil to the mix each time, The last 3 coats were with undiluted oil, which I prefer to put on with a rag. At this point the wood absorbs very little, and a brush here would just flood the surface and require tons to be wiped off and wasted. Then comes wax, which I warm up a little in my hands and then work it into the wood with my fingers. This is probably the last time I'll use this homemade mix, as the oil in it is getting very dry. There's like more dried skin than usable wax in the jar, and I want to experiment with carnauba wax and a less yellow oil instead. I don't mind the yellow tint on this cherry and some other woods, but I more and more often find myself looking for less yellow finishes. Finally, the wax is buffed with a rag, which gives it the sheen I'm looking for. All that remains is to attach the cushions, and for the ellipse the most sensible way seemed to be to screw it through the support pieces. When I'm better at upholstery, I might come back and put fabric over this to make the chair more presentable from the back, but it will be placed up against the wall most of the time, so this will be out of view. For the seat, I'll use these small angle brackets. I tightened the screw by hand the final half turn or so to not strip the threads in the relatively thin plywood. And there we have it, so I guess let's try it out. Pretty comfy, feels solid, seems like it works. Thank you for watching.